morning. My name is Caroline Aebersold, and I have the privilege of being the CEO of the Songroom, a role that I've had for almost a decade now. And it is such a pleasure to be here at the WISE Summit amongst so many educational leaders and to hear about so many other inspiring projects from all over the world, like We Love Reading. It is a real pleasure to be here. The theme of this year's WISE Summit, creativity at the heart of education, resonates so strongly with our work at the Songroom because our focus is all about the transformative power that creativity can have in education. And while the term creativity is something that can have such broad meaning and broad application in all areas of our learning, our work and our lives, we use the arts as a powerful tool of creativity, but as a way of inspiring that creativity in the broader sense in children's learning and development. When I first got involved with the Songroom, I came onto the board initially for a year before I took on the role of CEO, and I came from a background in the mental health sector, working as a psychologist, specialising in suicide prevention, so very pointy-end crisis intervention work often. And so I have to confess I was a little bit of a skeptic about the role that creativity could play and should play in learning and development. I thought, the arts and creativity, it's a nice to have, it's a feel-good, but not necessarily something that's critical. But it didn't take me long to realise how wrong that view was. And one of the early experiences in seeing a program that really made the penny drop for me was in a school in Melbourne, what we call a transitional school. They were 10 to 15-year-old children who mainstream schooling really couldn't cope with. They were often violent, they were angry, they were very disruptive, and so often were expelled from schools multiple times and ended up in these transition schools. And children aren't like that for no reason. These were children who came from households where there was often family violence, drug abuse, mental health issues. So we introduced a drumming program into this school. So first and foremost, they started hitting the drums rather than each other, which was a good start, very therapeutic. But what they also found is because the drumming program was something that was kind of cool, it was something they really wanted to participate in, and what they found very quickly is if they wanted to be good at it, they needed to cooperate with each other. They needed to work as a team, they needed to respect each other. For some of them even, they needed to just make eye contact with each other, which was something that they didn't often do. And I really saw at their graduation ceremony when they came to perform as a group and as a team, I saw the pride and the confidence and that teamwork on their faces and the way they worked with each other, and also on the faces of their parents who could see their kids for the first time in a more positive way. So to give you a little bit of context about our programs in Australia, overall in Australia we have an excellent standard of living. In Melbourne, the city that I live in, we've been ranked the world's most livable city many times over. We have a diverse and rich mix of cultures and backgrounds in Australia as predominantly a country of immigrants. We have a very high, proportionately, a very high number of new arrivals and refugees who are members of our community who bring very diverse language and cultural backgrounds and experiences to our country. We also have a vast geography. So our geography in Australia is nearly as big as the United States. It takes 5 hours to fly from one side of Australia to the other. And yet we have less than 10% of the population of the United States, with only around 25 million people. So we have a lot of geographic remoteness. We do also have a value traditionally in Australia of equality. We express it in a very Australian colloquialism of a fair go for all. But with all of those values and that diversity and richness of culture, we also have some significant social issues, including in the education sector. Our overall education performance compared to OECD countries has historically been very high. We often ranked in the top 5 for many years, but that's been slipping over the past few years. And the bigger issue perhaps is that there is a huge disparity of educational outcomes between the haves and the have-nots in our country. So in Australia, if you come from a low socioeconomic background, if you come from a non-English speaking background, if you're an Indigenous Australian, then your chances demographically of doing well in your schooling are drastically reduced. And addressing that education equity gap is what we really focus on in the work at the Songroom. So our vision is that all Australian children have the opportunity to participate in music and arts as a way of enhancing their broader educational, personal and developmental outcomes. We're a not-for-profit organisation, and we deliver programs to around 20,000 of our country's most disadvantaged children every single week, all over Australia, as a way of ensuring that all children of all backgrounds have the opportunity to engage in their learning and perform at their best and get the best possible start in life. We've positively impacted now on many hundreds of thousands of children in our country and seen the transformative power that the arts can have on improving educational outcomes for those disadvantaged children that we focus on. And what we see is that through the inclusive and positive participation in creativity, they're able to re-engage in their schooling, re-engage with each other, and then positively impact on their educational outcomes as well. So to share with you another more recent story of a program that really touched my heart, it was in a school in Melbourne where there were around 97% of those students in the school who came from a non-English speaking background, but they were expected to learn in their school in English nevertheless. There was one boy who was in that school who was about 11 years old, and he was a new arrival refugee from Africa. Many of his immediate family had been killed in his home country before he came to Australia with a fractured family. And he'd lived most of his life in a refugee camp with very limited access to education, no structured schooling, and for most of the time in survival mode. So when he started in our music program in that school, though, he really began to shine. You know, he'd come here with a lot of trauma that many of us can't even comprehend. And was very withdrawn, but he really shone when he got involved in music. One morning, though, he came into school and he was very withdrawn. He didn't go to his normal class. He went into the room where we have our program, the song room, and he sat down at the piano. And our teaching artist who was coming in to prepare for the class came in and saw him there. She didn't talk to him, he wasn't talking to anyone, but she came in and just watched him. And gradually some of his other classmates came into the room as well. And it was almost like they sensed that he needed some space. No one talked to him, but they started to sit down, a number of them next to him. One sat down at the piano and they just started to improvise and play music. Others picked up other instruments and started to play with him as well. And, you know, he'd come as a boy to our country from that very traumatic background to seek refuge. You know, he came as a refugee, and where he found that refuge was in his school, in that music, an environment where it was non-threatening, where language wasn't a barrier, and where he was able to just connect with other students in a way that gave him some refuge from the trauma and the chaos that was often in his life otherwise. Now, for me and for many people, and I think many people here, I'm probably preaching to the converted, examples like that are enough to convince us of the cause. But as a contemporary and a rigorous not-for-profit, for us, those case examples of the positive impact weren't enough alone to convince us of our model. So we really saw the value in ensuring that we had an evidence-based approach through evaluation and independent research. And with a large grant that we were able to secure through a corporate foundation, we commissioned a number of independent research institutions and universities to conduct research studies on the impact of our program on children's learning. And we were ready to find that there was no impact or that it wasn't a measurable impact, but what we found was that even we were surprised by the level of the difference that it could make in children's learning. So to highlight some of the examples of the impact of what creativity was having and the arts was having on children's learning and their well-being was that we found that through participating in our program compared to like schools who didn't have our program, that school grades were significantly improved. We saw a one-year improvement, a one-year gain in numeracy and literacy of the children who participated in our program. We saw increased attendance, so absenteeism in school was reduced by 65%, but also well-being outcomes, important well-being outcomes like improved confidence, self-esteem, cultural respect, and reduced depression, anxiety, and stress. We've also recently had some research that we're soon to publish on some of our programs in Indigenous communities in Australia, where there are large disparities between Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations in our country in education and other social outcomes. What we found in one of these regions, for example, is that where there was previously a gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students of 26% in their numeracy and literacy, after just 1 year of our weekly program, that gap was completely closed, so that Indigenous students improved their numeracy and literacy to a degree that they compared equally with their non-Indigenous peers, something that we've really grappled with in Australia to address over many, many decades. And that was compared to the rest of that community, where the Indigenous students in that community continued to perform at 25% less than their non-Indigenous peers. And many other qualitative studies that we've had as well that have looked at things like the social impact of the program and cultural cohesion and respect. A quote from one of the principals of one of the many schools that we work with, I think really highlights, although it's not coming up on the slide, really highlights the impact of those programs very simply, where she said that the positive experience of creating helps the students to feel more connected and confident, and as a result, they perform better at school. And you know, really when it comes down to it, it's not rocket science. Kids come to our program, they love the arts, they love creativity, and it instills in them a love of learning. So they feel connected to school, to each other, and they become willing and motivated learners, which spills over into all other areas of their learning and development. In spite of all of this, though, in Australia, only 1 in 4 schools have specialist teachers in music and arts. So about 1.5 million children in our country don't get access to those sorts of programs, and that's the kind of gap that we as a not-for-profit, mostly privately funded organisation are filling. So we have 2 types of programs that fill that gap, face-to-face and online programs. Our face-to-face programs have 3 main elements. The core of it are our weekly workshop programs, where we place what we call a teaching artist in the school, minimum of a day a week over 6 months, but often for 2 or 3 years to ensure that the program can be self-sustainable. And they deliver a tailored program that is integrated into the curriculum in the school, that builds capacity of the local teachers in that school, and that's focused on that student engagement. We also have early literacy programs focused on children up to the age of 5, alongside with their parents, which is very much about preparing them for school readiness, and parental engagement, active parental engagement in their schooling and in their early learning, which we do through the use of song and reading and storytelling. And then finally, we have our creative community events, which are very much community-led and driven programs that are about sort of bringing that important connection between school, parents and community, which is really key to long-term success in education. And the other thing that we do with our face-to-face programs is ensure that what we do is build capacity in that school and in that community and in those parents to make sure that after we leave with our initial program, that there is a self-sustainable program within that school to continue on. With our online programs, we reached a huge milestone last year when we launched our program Arts Live, which is an interactive online arts education portal. It has around 1,000 curriculum-aligned resources, very media-rich resources that are available for any teacher in Australia for free to use, and we already have it being used in about 3,500 schools in Australia now and growing all the time. So having developed this quite rigorous, innovative and evidence-based program to address what is a significant need in our country, where to from here? What are our goals and aspirations from here? What is the challenge and the opportunity for us? Well, when we started doing our strategic planning for our current 5-year strategy, we started out with 10 goals. But when we could really boil it down and get down to it, it came out with just 2 main goals. That was really just a segue so I could show that picture because I really like it. So our 2 strategic goals are firstly around depth, around our face-to-face programs and targeting 2,000 of our most disadvantaged schools in Australia to provide those face-to-face programs and bridge that education equity gap for 400,000 of our most disadvantaged kids in our country. And secondly, it is about reach, addressing the scale of the problem of those 1.5 million children in our country who are otherwise missing out. And we do that by building the capacity of teachers and using innovative technology with an online resource that can get that reach and make that difference. And we're also now looking at adapting that online content to international contexts, so looking at how we can adapt the curriculum framework and the context of the program to be able to deliver it to other countries who perhaps are missing out on that creativity in their classrooms as well. So our programs are designed to inspire the hopes and aspirations of children, and we like to try to embody, or we strive to embody that ethos in our organisation and in our work as well. So that's why it is, such a pleasure to be here at WISE and be able to share a little bit of our work with you. And I might just end with a quote from a great and influential philosopher, Plato, who said, "I would teach music, physics, and philosophy, but most importantly, music, because the patterns in music and all the arts are the keys to learning." Thank you very much.